What makes Agnon linguistically unique for a modern Hebrew writer?
You say, I'm sorry, linguistically?
Yeah, linguistic. What makes it unique as a modern Hebrew?
So readers of Agnon in Hebrew will note, as many have, that he's writing not in contemporary Hebrew. And that's not just because many of the stories were written in the 20s and 30s. You know, some of them were written well over 100 years ago. He had a very long career. His first piece of published writing, once he arrives in the land of Israel, is in 1908. And he was writing up until, you know, a number of months before his death in 1970. And of course, like I said, you know, for many years afterwards, there were posthumous works coming out. But his writing had a kind of anachronistic or old-fashioned feel even to his contemporary readers reading him in the 20s and 30s. It's not just that we read Agnon today and we say, gee, that's not the Hebrew you hear, you know, on an Egged bus, right? That was true when that particular story might have been written 100 years ago. Because at that time, as modern Hebrew was being reawoken, I say reawoken because it's something of a myth that Hebrew was revived, because in order to revive something, it has to first be dead. Hebrew wasn't dead, but it was kind of in a, you know, in a coma and needed to be reawoken, like Sleeping Beauty almost. Hebrew was always the language of scholarship. It was always the language of study, prayer. Hebrew was always the second language of at least literate Jews around the world. But it was not a language with which we were creating a modern literature. It was a language with which we were writing Torah scholarship. It was a language with which we were writing liturgical poetry, piyutim. It was a language in which, you know, a rabbi in Fez and a rabbi in northern France might have communicated with each other if they were sending she'elot to tshuvot back and forth. But it was not a language of modern literature because there was no modern Hebrew literature. And there was no idea, I mean, there may have been some kind of vague hope, tikva, but there was no kind of autonomous Jewish world in which we needed a daily language. The daily language was Yiddish, or it was Ladino, or it was Judeo-Arabic, or it was, you know, for us, it was for us and our parents and grandparents, it was English. But suddenly, with the revival or with the arrival of modern Zionism, the idea that we're going to reawaken Hebrew as a language of daily culture creates all types of possibilities. And we have to figure out, just like we have to, you know, invent a lexicon for all the words that we don't have, right? You know, people who study halakha know that there's a whole thesaurus full of words to describe every type of halachic issue. But you couldn't possibly take your car to a mechanic in Hebrew. You couldn't enter a pharmacy and do your business in Hebrew. And we had to create a whole lexicon of modern words that there had never been a need for. So when it comes to writing a modern story, where do you turn to? Many of Agnon's, in the overwhelming majority of cases, had Agnon's stories actually taken place? Had they been historical transcripts of real events, the conversations of real people? Certainly all of the stories set in Europe, the stories set in Germany, and very many of the stories even set in Eretz Yisrael in the first Aliyah would not have taken place in Hebrew. The dialogue would have been spoken in certainly Yiddish in the Old World, and even Yiddish in the old city of Jerusalem. So for example, one of Agnon's most beloved stories is set in the old city of Jerusalem in 1924. It's a story called Tehillah. It's a kind of long short story called Tehillah. It's about a very righteous old woman in 1924. She's 104 years old, And she's living in the Yishuv HaYashan, the old settlement, the old Jewish settlement that was centered around Jerusalem's old city. The story itself was published in 1950 after the fall of the old city. It's a kind of elegy for that world which had been lost after the establishment of the state. And the old city, of course, would not be retaken until after the Six-Day War. But all of the dialogue in that story amongst the people, the denizens, the Jews of the old city, would have been spoken in Yiddish. Agnon renders it to us in his Agnonian Hebrew. But which Agnonian Hebrew should he choose? The contemporary Hebrew of 1950, when the story is written, a kind of recollection of how Hebrew might have been spoken elsewhere in 1924. Well, that's no more authentic because that wasn't the language the characters actually would have been speaking. So he kind of creates this Agnonian Hebrew. It's been compared to Dickens's English, which contains all different types of registers with which Dickens can convey all types of things about the world that he's depicting. A high-class character is going to speak in one way, a pauper in the street is going to speak in another way. Or I mentioned earlier Mark Twain. Imagine the way Mark Twain depicts the dialogue of the different characters, not just Jim, the enslaved African, but even Huck and Tom. They don't speak in the way that Mark Twain's readers, when the story is published, would have spoken, and certainly not the way we do today. It's a way of kind of conveying that these characters are in a very distinct time and place. So Agnon does this by creating this Agnonic Hebrew. It's almost imagining, had there not been the historic catastrophe, that was the topic that he spoke of at his Nobel Prize speech, the historic catastrophe in which Jewish history was interrupted from the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Jewish people in the year 70 AD until their return at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Had there not been this historic catastrophe, had we not been dispersed, had we not been conducting our lives principally in all of these other languages, how could we imagine a kind of Hebrew that had developed on the uninterrupted spectrum? And he imagined that it would be a Hebrew that emanated much more directly from Rabbinic Hebrew, right? It's as if we're imagining the Hebrew of Chazal continued and extended without this 2,000-year blip. Now, of course, it has to be modernized. He needs all types of words. It depends on the story he's writing. If he's writing a story that's much more modernistic, it's going to play out in a different way than a story that's imagining, European Jewry. But it's a kind of strange thing. We're talking about Hasidim va'anshe ma'aseh, the righteous Jews of the 18th, 19th century in Europe. And he puts into their mouth dialogue, which is in some ways hearkening back to the rabbis of the Mishnah. That's, I think, in brief, a way to understand what he was doing linguistically.